Some men measure their worth in what they build. Other men measure it in what they can make you believe they built, smiling the whole time they're standing on nothing. My name is Walter Hensley, 67 years old, retired machinist, and for 19 years I watched a man named Richard Kessler treat me like the hired help at my own son's dinner table while I quietly kept that family's roof from caving in. I never said a word about it, not once, until the morning my daughter sent me a message that changed the shape of everything. It was a Tuesday in early June, hot the way Ohio gets hot right before a storm breaks it. I was out in the shed behind my house on Maple Ridge Road, re-gluing the legs on a rocking chair I'd been building for my granddaughter's room, when my phone lit up on the workbench. I figured it was my daughter Claire confirming what time to pick me up for Lily's confirmation dinner that Saturday. I wiped the sawdust off my hands and picked it up. It wasn't a confirmation. It was a door closing. Dad, please don't come to the dinner Saturday. Richard says it should just be his side this time. Keep it simple. I hope you get it. I read it once. Then I read it again, slower, like maybe the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. My own daughter, my only daughter, telling me to stay home while my granddaughter celebrated one of the biggest days of her young life. I set the phone face down on the workbench, picked the glue brush back up, and kept working. Not because it didn't cut deep. It cut deep the way betrayal always does when it comes wrapped in a soft voice, smooth on the surface, serrated underneath. But I'd had 19 years of practice swallowing things whole. I wasn't going to fall apart over a text message. Not yet, anyway. Let me back up, because you need the whole picture before you decide who the villain is in this story, including me. 19 years ago, my daughter Claire was 23 and waiting tables at a diner outside Akron when she brought home a man named Richard Kessler and told me she was in love. Richard came from a family in Shaker Heights that talked about money the way other families talk about weather constantly, and like it explained everything about who you were. His father, a man named Douglas Kessler, took one look at Claire's chipped nail polish and her second-hand Corolla and decided, right there at that first dinner, that his son had married down. Every holiday after that felt like an audit. Douglas would sit at the head of his glass dining table in that big house with the circular driveway and hold court like a man reading off a verdict. Claire, didn't you want to finish that nursing degree? Such a shame how life gets in the way. Or his favorite aimed square at me, a machinist. Huh. Good, honest work. Somebody's got to do it, said with a smile, always with a smile. His wife Marlene was softer about it, in the way a slow leak is softer than a flood. She'd just tilt her head and say, "We only want Claire to have the life she deserves." Like Claire, and by extension me, were the only things standing between her and that life. I used to drive home from those dinners in my old Ford pickup, windows down, and I'd talk out loud to my late wife Dorothy sitting in the empty passenger seat. "Dorothy," I'd say, "that man's arrogance is pressed sharper than his shirts." I could almost hear her laugh at that. But here's what nobody understood about why I kept showing up and swallowing every one of Douglas Kessler's little insults. It wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Claire had already lost enough of herself in that marriage. Not because of Richard, who I do believe loved her, but because of what her in-laws made her feel every single time she sat at their table. The last thing I was going to do was force my daughter to choose between her father and her husband's family. That would have broken something in her that never grew back. So I stayed quiet. I passed the rolls. I kept building. 4 years ago, Richard and Claire bought a split level on Aldersgate Court in a good school district, the kind of place a young family stretches every dollar to get into. When the place started falling apart around them, a furnace on its last legs, a basement that flooded every spring, wiring so old the inspector flagged it twice. Claire mentioned it to me almost apologetically one Sunday afternoon in my garage. "It's just one thing after another, Dad. I don't know how we're going to keep up." She wasn't asking me for money. Claire never asked me for money directly. That wasn't the kind of woman she was. Too proud to ask, too tired to hide it. I didn't make a speech about it. I called my accountant that Monday and started moving funds. $81,000 over 11 months. New furnace, French drain system, complete rewire, a finished basement built exactly the way my granddaughter Lily described it to me over milkshakes at the Dairy Chalet, a reading nook, built-in shelves, the works. I supervised every contractor myself, Drove out there 3 or 4 times a week, called in favors from men I'd worked alongside for 35 years to make sure it was done right. And here's the part I never told Claire, the real reason behind it. I'd watched my daughter shrink a little more every time she sat across from Douglas Kessler and felt like she wasn't enough. And as long as I had money and 2 working hands, my daughter was never going to go to that man with an open palm. That was the line I drew for myself. The final payment, $11,000, was scheduled to release the Monday after Lily's confirmation dinner, the dinner I'd just been uninvited from. I stood in that shed a long while that night, hand resting on the rocking chair, phone sitting face down on the bench. 67 years old, buried my wife, spent my whole life building things with these 2 hands, and my own daughter can't save me a folding chair at a dinner table. I picked the phone back up, opened Claire's message, and typed 6 words. Understood. Have a good time. I hit send. Then I called my accountant, a steady, no-nonsense man named Arthur Pell who'd handled my finances for 15 years. Arthur, that basement payment. Hold it. Don't release it Monday. There was a pause on the line. Everything all right, Walter? Not yet, I told him. But it will be. I hung up, walked back to the chair, picked up the sandpaper, and for the first time in 19 years, I stopped building things for people who didn't want me at their table. By 10 the next morning, the day of Lily's confirmation dinner, the crew doing the basement finish work packed up their tools and left the Aldersgate Court property without a word to anyone but Arthur's office. The basement sat half-done subfloor exposed, shelving stacked in a corner, drywall dust still hanging in the air. The phone call that told me everything I needed to know about my son-in-law's family came in at 6:52 the next morning, and she didn't even say good morning. Dad, what did you do? Claire's voice, tight, already accusing me before I'd had my coffee. Morning to you too, sweetheart, I said, leaning on my kitchen counter. Guessing the crew didn't show up today. They said the payment stopped. They said you froze it. Her voice cracked somewhere between anger and panic. Dad, we have people coming Saturday. Richard's parents, the Fitzgeralds from the club. I know exactly who's coming, Claire, I said, slow and even. I helped pick half the menu, remember? So fix it. I think there's been a misunderstanding about my situation, I said, keeping my voice gentle. I was told I'm not welcome at this dinner. Figured that meant my checkbook wasn't welcome either. Silence on the other end. The kind where you can practically hear somebody's whole plan collapsing in real time. I hung up before she could answer. First time in 19 years I ever hung up on my daughter. Felt worse than I expected, and better than I expected, both at once. If you think stopping that payment was the worst thing I did, stick around, because what came next didn't just shake their world, it took the floor out from under it. There's a specific kind of quiet that follows a decision you can't undo, not peaceful, not empty, just final, like the last screw driven into a joint. That's what my kitchen felt like the morning after Lily's confirmation dinner. I made coffee, sat at the table Dorothy and I had shared for 29 years, and I waited, because I knew Claire would come. I just didn't know how long her pride would hold out before the panic won. It took 2 days. Thursday evening, I heard the knock, not the doorbell, the knock, hard and rehearsed, like somebody had practiced the whole speech on the drive over. I opened the door. Claire stood on my porch in her work scrubs, jaw tight, eyes rimmed red. Her car was still running in the driveway. She'd planned to make this quick. Dad, she said, and the word came out like it cost her something. What is going on? I've got the crew calling me, saying the job's shut down. The basement's a disaster. What did you do? I stepped back from the door. Come in, Claire. I don't need to come in. I need to Claire. I said it quieter that time. Come inside. She came in. I poured her coffee without asking, set it down across from me at the table, and looked at my daughter. Really looked at her, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. She looked tired. Not just today tired. Years tired. You sent me a text Tuesday, I said. She shifted in her chair. Dad, that was. Richard was stressed about the dinner. And his father. You sent me a text, I said again, calm, even, telling me I wasn't welcome at my own granddaughter's confirmation. Yes or no? Silence. Yes, she said finally, quiet. Okay, I nodded. Then you understand why I made the call I made. No, Dad, I really don't. Because that's $11,000 sitting between us and a finished basement, and you're making a point. I'm not making a point, Claire, I said, leaning forward. I'm drawing a line. There's a difference. A point is something you make to win an argument. A line is something you draw when you finally respect yourself enough to draw it. She stared at me. I let it sit there. I spent $81,000 on that house, I said. Not because you asked, but because I watched you get smaller every time you sat across from Douglas Kessler, feeling like you weren't enough. And I decided that as long as I had money, my daughter was never going to a man like that with her hand out. I paused. That was a promise I made to myself. Not to you. To myself. Her jaw worked. Dad, but if I'm not family enough to get a seat at the table, I said, then I'm not obligated to keep financing the life you're building at that table. That's not spite, sweetheart. That's just arithmetic. She left 20 minutes later. Car still warm. I watched her pull out of the driveway and felt something I hadn't felt in 19 years. Like myself again. Now here's where the story turns, and you'll want to pay attention, because this is where the whole thing starts cracking wide open. Claire went home and told Richard everything, and Richard did exactly what I figured he'd do. He called his mother. Claire told me later, almost word for word, how it went. Richard pacing the half-finished basement, phone against his ear. Mom, Walter froze the renovation money, all of it. We need Dad to cover the last payment, or the whole basement stalls out. Marlene's answer, delivered in that practiced, everything's fine tone she always used, was don't worry, honey. I'll talk to your father. 6 words that have ruined more families than any recession ever has. Douglas called Richard himself the next morning, and I wish I could have seen his face when he made that call, because Douglas Kessler was a man who lived for moments exactly like this one, moments where he got to swoop in and remind everybody who the real provider was. Richard, don't you worry about a thing. I'll make some calls. This is nothing. Big voice, total confidence. The cavalry had arrived. Richard actually felt relieved. That relief lasted about 40 hours. Douglas promised the cash by Monday. Monday came and went. Tuesday brought a text about some kind of wire transfer delay. By Wednesday, his phone was going straight to voicemail. Thursday morning, unable to look at his gutted basement any longer, Richard drove out to Shaker Heights to sit across from his father in that big formal living room with the leather furniture and the framed golf trophies and asked him straight out, "Do you have the money or not?" And Douglas Kessler, the man who'd spent 19 years making my daughter feel small at his own table, looked across that glass coffee table and said, "It's complicated right now, son. Complicated." Richard started pulling threads after that. And once you pull one thread in a town like Shaker Heights, the whole coat comes apart in your hands. Because I'd already told Arthur to draft paperwork looking into my legal standing on that house, Richard had to check into the loan situation himself, which sent him digging through the county property records for his own father's finances. What he found there shook him to his core. The Shaker Heights house, the crown jewel, had been refinanced 3 times in 5 years. The equity was bled dry. The bank basically owned it outright. Once his eyes were open, the small stuff started painting the real picture. He remembered a call from a collections office a month back he'd waved off as a wrong number. Now he knew better. He called a buddy who worked at the country club pro shop, and his buddy went quiet on the line before finally admitting Douglas's membership had been suspended 8 months ago for non-payment. The leased Cadillac sitting in that circular driveway was one missed payment from repossession. Douglas Kessler wasn't wealthy. Douglas Kessler was a performance, and the curtain had just come down in the middle of the second act. Richard called me that night, close to 10. "Dad." His voice was different, hollow, like a man who'd just walked through a door he couldn't walk back through. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Say what?" I asked. "That he was all of it. Why didn't you say something?" I was quiet a moment. "It wasn't mine to say," I told him. "A man doesn't tear down his son-in-law's family to prove a point, even when the point needs proving." He didn't answer right away. I could hear him breathing on the other end. 19 years, Dad. I know. He made Claire feel like every single dinner, every holiday, every time she tried to, he stopped, started again, and the whole time he was, "Yeah," I said softly. "The whole time." Long pause. "What do I do now?" And that right there, that question, Was the most groan I'd heard my son-in-law sound in 19 years. Nothing tonight, I said. Get some rest. We'll sort the rest out. Meanwhile, I'd had my own conversation with Arthur Pell. Arthur's the kind of man who doesn't waste a syllable. Walter, he said, looking over the paperwork, when you funded that renovation, your contractor's lien filing gives you an actual recorded interest in that property. That means if things go south, you have standing to petition for repayment through the courts, possibly even force a sale to recover what's owed. I sat with that a minute. I didn't want to force a sale. That was never the goal. Lily lived in that house, but I also wasn't going to stay legally tied to a property where I'd just been told my presence was inconvenient. Draft the lien enforcement letter, I said. Don't file it yet. Just send a copy to Richard and Claire so they understand I'm serious about protecting what's mine. Understood, Arthur said. Walter, you sure about this? Arthur, I said, leaning back. I've been sure about very few things in my life. This is one of them. When Richard got that letter, the quiet, retired machinist from Maple Ridge Road had actual legal standing to move toward recovering his money through the courts. The panic that followed was, by all accounts, biblical. Claire called Richard at work. Richard called Arthur's office and was politely told that Mr. Pell represented Walter Hensley and couldn't discuss the matter with him. Claire called Marlene, who called Douglas, who apparently threw a golf trophy across that formal living room hard enough to crack the drywall. I heard about that secondhand. I won't pretend I didn't smile a little. Neighbors on Aldersgate Court were already talking. A stalled basement renovation with a dumpster still sitting in the driveway isn't subtle. People notice, people talk. Shaker Heights is a big suburb with a small-town memory. The image Douglas had spent 19 years constructing the successful patriarch, the man of means, was coming apart in public, one unanswered question at a time. That's when Lily showed up at my door. Not Claire, not Richard. Lily, 13 years old, dropped off by a friend's mother, standing on my porch in her confirmation dress from Saturday, the one she never got to wear in front of me. Grandpa. She looked at me steady. I talked to Mr. Alvarez, one of the contractors. He said you paid for almost the whole basement. I stepped aside. Come in, Lily. She came in without needing a second invitation. I set a root beer in front of her, sat down across from her at Dorothy's table, and I opened a folder I'd kept in the kitchen drawer since the day I froze the payment. Receipts, invoices, the payment schedule, $81,400 itemized down to the last screw. She looked through every page slowly, carefully, the way I'd taught her to read a wiring diagram. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, though she didn't let them spill. They told me you gave up on us, she said. I know, I said. That's not what this says. She tapped the folder. No, I agreed, it's not. She was quiet a long moment. So why'd you stop? I looked at my granddaughter, this girl I'd taught to cast a fishing line off the dock at Portage Lakes, and I told her the truth. Because there's a difference between loving your family, I said, and letting your family treat you like you're invisible. She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her root beer, leaned back, and said, quiet, matter of fact, Grandpa, I never once thought you were invisible. And just like that, 67 years old, retired, widowed, I had to work hard to keep my own eyes dry. The house wasn't sold. The basement wasn't finished right away. And the money didn't end up where anybody expected. But the most permanent move I made wasn't legal, and it wasn't financial. There's a moment in a man's life when he stops reacting and starts deciding, not out of anger, but out of something quieter and more dangerous clarity. I hit that moment on a Sunday morning at Dorothy's table, coffee gone cold, a legal pad in front of me covered in numbers, $81,000, 19 years, one text message. I picked up my pen and started writing. Arthur showed up at my house at 9 sharp that Sunday, drove his same sensible sedan, carried the same worn briefcase that had seen more family disasters than a therapist's office couch. Before we start, he said, I want you fully certain, Walter, because what you're about to do is permanent. Arthur, I said, I've been thinking this through for 19 years. I'm only now writing it down. He almost smiled. All right then, let's get to work. Here's what most people get wrong about quiet men. They think quiet means passive. They think because a man doesn't raise his voice, he's not thinking 3 moves ahead. They think because he passes the rolls and absorbs every insult without flinching, he's got nothing left to play. Douglas Kessler made that mistake for 19 years. It cost him everything. While Richard and Claire scrambled to find $11,000 for a contractor, while Douglas made calls that went nowhere and gave explanations that convinced nobody, I sat with Arthur, restructuring every financial decision I'd ever made on that family's behalf. First order of business, releasing my legal claim on the Aldersgate Court property, but only once Richard agreed, in writing, to a repayment plan that put the responsibility squarely where it belonged on him, not on Lily, not on the house itself. It cost him a real, uncomfortable monthly hit to his own budget for the next several years, but it made the debt his to carry, honestly, the way it should have been from the start. He signed it without an argument. I think some part of him needed to. Second order of business, and this is the one that mattered most. The 81,000 I'd already spent, gone, a gift freely given, and I had no interest in clawing that back from my daughter. But the 11,000 still sitting in my account, the payment that never got released, that money had a new destination. Lily turned 14 that October, 3 weeks before her birthday. She got a certified letter at the house on Aldersgate Court, addressed specifically to her. Not to Claire, not to Richard, to her. Inside was paperwork from Arthur's office finalizing a protected education trust in her name. That $11,000, the exact amount Douglas had once bragged around the dinner table he was setting aside for her someday, completely funded it. I didn't just protect my money. I took the exact shortfall Douglas left behind and used it to secure my granddaughter's future in his place. Alongside the paperwork was a handwritten note from me. 1 page, blue ink, my handwriting that Lily always said looked like a blueprint. It read, "Lily, a basement can be rebuilt. Character can't. I hope this helps you build both. Every dollar in this account was earned honestly and is yours completely. No conditions, no strings, nobody else's name on it. Use it to become exactly who Grandma and I always knew you'd be. All my love, Grandpa." Claire called me 20 minutes after Lily showed her the letter. "Dad." Her voice cracked on the first word, and I could hear 19 years of things neither of us had ever said sitting right behind it. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. That was the money for the I know what it was for, Claire." Silence. "Why?" she asked. Simple, no performance behind it. "Because your daughter deserves to start her life without owing anybody anything," I said. "That's a feeling I wanted you to have. Didn't get it to you soon enough. I'm giving it to her now." She didn't answer right away. I heard her exhale, long and slow, like she was setting something down she'd been carrying for years. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said finally. "For the text. For the dinner. For letting it go on this long." I let that sit in the air a moment, let it mean what it meant. "Come by Sunday," I said. "I'll do a pot roast. We'll sit in the shed like we used to." "Yeah," she said quietly. "I'd like that. Now I know what you're waiting to hear. You want to know what happened to Douglas Kessler. So did I. The letter Arthur drafted had already done its damage before I ever needed to file a thing. Word travels in a town like Shaker Heights, fast and far. A father-in-law with a recorded legal claim, quietly circling, is not a whisper, it's a fire bell. Douglas's name got attached to the whole mess, and the story of the stalled basement and the frozen money and the scramble to cover it became neighborhood knowledge inside of 2 weeks. The kind of thing traded at the farmer's market and over coffee at the diner on Chagrin Road. But the real unraveling didn't happen in Shaker Heights. It happened in Douglas's own dining room. Richard brought the county records and the club suspension notice home one evening and laid them out on the kitchen table without shouting. Claire sat across from him and read every page in silence. She looked at the debt totals, the missed payments, the whole performance her father had run just to keep up appearances, and she went very still, the color draining out of her face. "He told me we came from money," she said finally, barely a whisper. "He told me that my whole life." Richard reached across and covered her hand. "I know," he said. "He looked down on your father," she said, voice tightening. "He looked down on Dad." "For what?" she asked. "For being honest about what he actually had." Claire called me herself 3 days later. I didn't expect that. For 19 years we'd kept a cool, transactional distance where Douglas's family was concerned. But watching her father's whole illusion collapse had clearly cracked something open in her, forced her to see who'd actually been holding her family up the whole time. This call was different. No armor in it. "Dad," she said, steady but with real effort behind it, "I owe you an apology, a real one." "Claire, let me finish, please," she said. "I pushed Richard to ask my father for help when you froze the payment. I thought they could fix anything, because I'd spent my whole life believing they could." Pause. "I didn't know about the debt, any of it. But that's not an excuse, because I knew what my father put you and Richard through at those dinners, and I let it happen. I let it happen for years, and I'm sorry." I was quiet a moment. Dorothy always used to say the strongest thing a person can do is apologize with no exit ramp built into it. "I appreciate that, Claire," I said. "I mean it. And for what it's worth, I never blamed you. Not once." "You should have," she said softly. "Maybe," I said. "But I didn't. Douglas called me exactly once in 19 years. One time did that man dial my number directly, with no audience to perform for. A Friday evening, late July. I was out in the shed. The rocking chair I'd built for Lily was long finished, stained and sitting in her room. My phone buzzed, unknown number, Shaker Heights area code. I picked up. Walter. His voice was different without a dinner table between us, smaller somehow, like a building that looks impressive from the street and hollow the second you're standing inside it. "I think we should talk, man to man." Man to man, 19 years in, and suddenly we're men. "We're talking right now, Douglas," I said. Silence. He hadn't expected it to be that easy. "Look," he said, "things got complicated with the money, and I want you to know none of it was intentional, the situation with Richard and the house." "Douglas," I said, setting down the sandpaper, "I'm going to stop you right there." He stopped. "I don't need an explanation," I said. "I'm not angry with you. I want that clear. I'm not angry. I'm just done pretending I don't see what I see. Done funding a story where you're the patriarch and I'm the help. Done being welcome at that table only when my checkbook's useful and shown the door the second it's not." I paused. "I'm retired, Douglas. From the trade. From all of it." Long silence on the line. When he spoke again, the big voice was gone, and what replaced it was something I'd never once heard from Douglas Kessler. A small man. "I suppose I owe you more than I ever paid," he said slowly. "You don't owe me a thing," I said, and I meant it. "Just leave my daughter's family alone. Let Richard stand up straight for once. That's all I ever wanted out of any of this." He hung up. I set the phone down, picked the sandpaper back up, and finished the last coat on a birdhouse I'd started for Lily's window. Lily's 14th birthday happened on a warm Saturday afternoon in late September, in my own backyard on Maple Ridge Road. First real family gathering since the whole thing settled. No catering, no country club lawn, no place cards, and certainly no Douglas Kessler holding court at the head of anything. Just my yard, twinkle lights strung through the maple tree, a cooler of root beer and lemonade, a sheet cake from the same bakery Dorothy and I had ordered from since Claire was a girl. Richard showed up early to help me set the folding tables. We didn't talk much, didn't need to. There's a kind of quiet between a father-in-law and a son-in-law that's been repaired. Not perfect, still some scar tissue in it, but repaired, and it feels entirely different from the quiet of two people avoiding each other. It feels like relief. Claire brought flowers from her own garden and set them in mason jars down the tables without being asked. She caught my eye once and gave me a small nod. I nodded back. Lily showed up with two friends from school, loud the way 14-year-olds are supposed to be loud, and when she came through the back gate and saw the lights, the tables, her parents standing together with nothing to prove to anybody, her grandfather at the grill in an old flannel shirt with tongs in his hand and not one apology to give, she walked straight over and hugged me the way you hug someone you were scared of losing. "Thanks for not giving up on us, Grandpa," she said into my shoulder. 67 years old, and I held on a little longer than I probably should have. "Wasn't ever an option," I told her. "Now go on. You're making me look sentimental in front of company." She laughed big and easy and ran off to find her friends. While we were celebrating in that backyard, Douglas and Marlene were sitting in an empty house in Shaker Heights, staring at a foreclosure notice. The leased Cadillac was already back on a dealership lot, returned quietly on a weekday morning with nobody watching. I never had to lift a finger to bring Douglas Kessler down. A lifetime of borrowed money and borrowed pride did that all on its own. I just stopped holding up the mirror for him. There's something nobody tells you about revenge, the kind that actually holds. It doesn't feel like fire. It feels like a warm September evening in your own backyard. Lights in the maple tree, your granddaughter laughing with her friends, your daughter sitting in a lawn chair, looking more like herself than you've seen in years. It feels like finally understanding the difference between what you built and what you only ever funded. Douglas funded an illusion. I built a family. And on that Saturday evening, watching Lily blow out 14 candles while her friends cheered, Richard walked over to where I stood by the grill, looked at the smoke curling off the coals, then looked at me. "I pulled up that text I sent you back in June, Dad," he said, voice thick. "I don't even recognize the man who wrote it. I'm sorry for all of it." He reached out, and for the first time in 19 years, my son-in-law hugged me like he finally understood who'd actually been standing behind his family the whole time. Watching those candles get blown out, the lights twinkling in that old maple tree, I finally understood something Dorothy had been trying to tell me for years. The greatest thing a man can leave behind isn't money, and it isn't property, and it isn't even his name. It's the truth of who he was when nobody was watching, when it would have been so much easier to keep smiling, keep writing checks, and call being used the same thing as being loved. My name is Walter Hensley, 67 years old, retired machinist, and I built something Douglas Kessler never could. I built something that actually lasts.